The world's longest artificial clear-cut strip isn't a logging operation or a major highway project. It's the U.S.-Canada border itself. And would you believe the last contested territory between these two nations is a mere 20-acre rock in the Atlantic Ocean, populated by approximately 10,000 puffins, or that Niagara Falls erodes 60 tons of rock every 60 seconds. Truly, the boundary between the United States and Canada is far more unusual than the average person realizes. This 5,525-mile demarcation slices through lakes, vast wildernesses, and even people's living rooms. It conceals some of the most peculiar geographical anomalies on the planet. Get ready, because we're about to unveil 50 astonishing facts about the U.S.-Canada border you likely haven't heard before. Fact 50: the longest clear-cut strip on Earth is this very border. Along its entire stretch, there's a 20-foot wide corridor where every tree has been intentionally felled and impeccably maintained. Dubbed the quote, _0, this strip is vigilantly managed by the International Boundary Commission around the clock, even across hundreds of miles of remote Alaskan and Yukon wilderness where human habitation is almost non-existent. The rationale behind it is simple: to ensure anyone standing there can unequivocally determine their location. Viewed from space, it appears as though a giant razor blade has carved a line across the continent. Fact 49: what appears to be a straight line on the border is actually 900 crooked segments. Every map depicts the border stretching from Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean as a perfectly straight divide along the 49th parallel. In reality, it's quite convoluted. 19th century surveyors were tasked with marking 1,260 miles of undeveloped land armed solely with compasses, celestial navigation, and iron chains. No GPS, no satellite imagery, no second attempts. The result was over 900 distinct segments that deviate by as much as 810 meters from the actual parallel. A treaty signed in 1908 formalized this situation. The physical markers, despite their inaccuracies, became the official boundary, so that seemingly straight line actually meanders quite a bit, like someone who's had a few too many drinks. Fact 48: due to imprecise surveying, Canada inadvertently gained an additional 26 square miles. If you sum up all the southward deviations along the winding 49th parallel, you uncover a rather significant surveying error. Because those 19th century surveyors tended to drift slightly south, Canada ended up with roughly 26 more square miles of territory that, mathematically speaking, ought to belong to the United States. That's 3 square miles larger than the island of Manhattan. This land was lost to 1800s technology incapable of precisely charting a perfect curve across a continent. The fascinating part is that no one is disputing it. Again, international law stipulates that the physical boundary markers constitute the official border, even when they are incorrect. The U.S., in essence, is technically missing a piece of land it never realized it possessed. Fact 47: the U.S. maintains a town accessible only by traveling through Canada. Point Roberts is a 5-square-mile anomaly created when the 49th parallel cleanly bisected the tip of a Canadian peninsula, isolating a small section of Washington state on the Canadian side of the boundary. Approximately 1,200 individuals reside here permanently, frequently crossing into British Columbia for groceries, medical appointments, and nearly all other necessities. This isolation transformed into a full-blown crisis in 2020 when the border abruptly closed. detached from the Canadian consumers who provided 85% of its economic activity, Point Roberts became a ghost town overnight. The state had to implement an emergency ferry service simply to reestablish its connection to the rest of America. Fact 46. School commutes here entail 4 border crossings daily. What's the most intricate route to school you can envision? For children in Point Roberts, it involves exiting the United States twice each day. The town's school only serves up to 3rd grade. Following that, students board a bus that travels into Canada, re-enters Washington State at Blaine, and reverses this entire journey every afternoon. That amounts to 4 international border crossings every school day. Passports are a requirement for math class. When the pandemic caused the border to shut, families faced the difficult choice of relocating, separating, or removing their children from school entirely. Fact 45. A cartographer's error led to America's northernmost point outside of Alaska. Benjamin Franklin was an exceptional diplomat, but his maps left much to be desired. The 1783 Treaty of Paris relied on the highly flawed Mitchell map, which incorrectly positioned Lake of the Woods and drastically misidentified the source of the Mississippi River. The treaty stipulated that the border should extend west from the lake's northwesternmost point to the Mississippi, a path that was geographically impossible. The resolution: a vertical line was drawn south to the 49th parallel, unintentionally creating the northwest angle, a 123-square-mile segment of Minnesota jutting into Canada like a chimney. It's the only part of the contiguous U.S. located north of the 49th parallel. It has no land connection to the rest of the country, obliging its inhabitants to cross into Canada simply to purchase groceries. Fact 44. To reach Minnesota from other parts of Minnesota, you must exit the country. The road access for the northwest angle is genuinely preposterous. There is no American road linking it to the remainder of the United States. Driving to this particular spot from Minnesota involves a curious journey. Heading north to War Road, crossing into Canada, navigating over 60 miles of gravel roads in Manitoba, and then re-entering the U.S. at the angle, which means undergoing customs procedures twice. Alternatively, in the summer, one can traverse Lake of the Woods by boat, or in the heart of winter, a snowmobile is an option. The treacherous transitional seasons, when the ice is either too thin for foot traffic or not fully melted, necessitate flying in. This makes it the most geographically detached portion of the contiguous United States. It's fascinating that the U.S. Customs outpost at the angle consists merely of a phone booth located in a parking lot. So what does border surveillance entail at America's most awkwardly situated boundary? Picture a gravel lot dubbed Jim's Corner, where a tiny booth houses a video phone. You press a button, a customs agent appears on screen, asks a few questions, and cameras verify your vehicle. Once the call concludes, you're granted entry. That's the entire process, the complete setup designed to safeguard the northernmost tip of the contiguous U.S. occupies a space no larger than a telephone box. It functions perfectly well, yet it's undeniably amusing. In 1997, the approximately 100 residents of the Northwest Angle initiated one of the most peculiar demonstrations in American history. Ontario had prohibited American citizens from keeping fish unless they lodged at Canadian resorts, a regulation that jeopardized the Angle's entire economic base. Incensed, the inhabitants reacted as any true Americans would. They threatened to secede. Congressman Colin Peterson intervened with a constitutional amendment proposal that would allow them to vote on joining Manitoba. It was an attention-grabbing tactic that succeeded. securing headlines and compelling the U.S. government to respond. Canada ultimately rescinded its policy, fishing regulations were aligned, and the angle managed to remain American, albeit just barely. The final stretch of land under dispute between the U.S. and Canada isn't a military installation or a gold mine, it's Machias Seal Island, a 20-acre rock formation in the Atlantic. Both nations have asserted claims to it since the Revolutionary War, and neither shows any sign of yielding. Canada annually stations 2 lighthouse keepers there as living symbols of sovereignty. Despite the lighthouse being fully automated, the U.S. acknowledges its claim to the island, but effectively cedes control to its genuine rulers. Nearly 10,000 Atlantic puffins. You can disembark from Maine without a passport, interact with the Canadian personnel, and let the birds settle the ownership issue. When the U.S. and Canada presented their Gulf of Maine maritime boundary dispute to the International Court of Justice in 1979, they made a deliberate choice. Machias Seal Island would not be mentioned. Neither nation desired to risk an unfavorable ruling, so they mutually decided to omit it from discussions entirely. The island remains in legal limbo to this day. Fishermen from both countries operate in these contentious waters under differing regulatory frameworks. The official approach to resolving this sovereignty question is, apparently, perpetual silence. On Canusa Street, which bisects Beebe Plain, Vermont, and Stansted, Quebec, the yellow center line is more than just a traffic divider. It is an international border. Canada lies to the north and America to the south. Local lore suggests that surveyors, after perhaps too many drinks, drew the 45th parallel directly through people's front yards. Today, simply stepping across the street to borrow a cup of sugar is technically considered illegal entry. Consequently, residents use flower pot barriers to prevent accidental crossings. The sidewalk is Canadian property, meaning Americans are ostensibly required to walk in the gutter to stay within their legal bounds. This street even once hosted the world's sole international post office, featuring 2 national counters within a single building. Darby Line, Vermont, and Stansted, Quebec, aren't truly distinct municipalities. They constitute a single community bisected by a major international border. Their infrastructure is thoroughly integrated. Potable water is sourced from Canadian wells, stored in an American reservoir, and then piped back through Canada. Sewage from Darby Line crosses into Quebec for treatment. Fire departments respond to emergencies on either side without requiring passport checks. Prior to 9/11, they shared healthcare facilities and curling clubs. While the border is more pronounced now, the underlying plumbing network remains unchanged. It's 2 nations, 1 system, connected by pipes and a spirit of cooperation. In 1816, the United States commenced construction of an imposing stone fortress on Lake Champlain, intended to thwart Canadian incursions. There was just one issue. A subsequent survey revealed the border was located a mile further south. America had inadvertently erected its state-of-the-art defense on British territory. Mortified, the military abandoned the structure, which locals quickly dubbed, quote, "one," and nearby farmers repurposed the stones to build barns. An 1842 treaty eventually adjusted the border, allowing the U.S. to rebuild the site as Fort Montgomery. Today, the remnants are incorporated into roadfill. Would you be interested in acquiring this regionally embarrassing piece of real estate? The location occasionally surfaces on the market for approximately $1 million. Insight 36. The border's poetic gesture. At the Blaine, Washington crossing, one of the busiest points along the entire frontier, A 67-foot concrete arch proudly spans the boundary between the United States and Canada, with a foundation in each nation. Constructed in 1921 to commemorate a century of peace between the two countries, it resides within a small international park where citizens from both sides can enter freely without requiring passports. The inscription on the American side reads, "Children of a common mother." On the Canadian side, it proclaims, "Brethren dwelling together in unity." For a border characterized by its peculiarities, conflicts, and surveying blunders, this particular monument stands out as perhaps its most profoundly human moment. Insight 35. A Native American nation, divided. The border cleaves a Native American community, subsequently managed by three distinct governmental bodies. The Mohawk Territory of Akwesasne existed long before either nation drew a line dissecting it. Nevertheless, that boundary arrived, splitting the community across the U.S.-Canada divide into sections within New York, Ontario, and Quebec, creating a complex administrative labyrinth where three separate authorities oversee all aspects concurrently. Due to the presence of the St. Lawrence River, the Quebec portion functions almost as an exclave. Residents must travel through New York and clear U.S. customs merely to access the rest of Canada. The border is so intrusive that it bisects individual homes, resulting in some families literally residing in two countries simultaneously. Insight 34. The Alaska Panhandle Deception. Canada endured a significant setback in 1903 concerning the Alaska Panhandle. The definitive boundary between Alaska and British Columbia had been a source of contention for years. Consequently, both parties agreed to allow a 6-person tribunal to resolve the matter. 3 Americans, 2 Canadians, and a British judge. The British judge ultimately sided with the Americans. This outcome deprived Canada of access to the Pacific Coast inlets, which it desperately needed for the Yukon trade routes. The Canadian representatives declined to endorse the ruling. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier denounced it as a betrayal, leveraging the humiliation to advocate for Canada's need for an independent foreign policy completely separate from Britain. Thus, a border dispute inadvertently contributed to a nation's journey towards self-governance. Insight 33. The Great Lakes' enormous freshwater reserve. The Great Lakes collectively hold 21% of the world's surface freshwater. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, form a colossal liquid barrier between the United States and Canada. Only Lake Michigan is situated entirely within American territory. These inland seas combined contain over 20% of the planet's accessible surface freshwater. To provide some context, if this entire volume of water were poured over the contiguous 48 states, the entire nation, from Florida to Washington, would be submerged under nearly 5 feet of water. This is not merely a border. It represents 2 nations sharing one of Earth's most vital, life-sustaining systems. Insight 32. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are, hydrologically speaking, one lake. Inquiring with a scientist about the number of Great Lakes might elicit the answer of 4. This is because Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are, from a technical perspective, a single continuous body of water, connected by the 3-mile-wide Straits of Mackinac. The straits maintain identical water levels for both, exchanging enough volume daily to equal the flow of the Mississippi River. If cartography accurately reflected scientific reality, the combined Lake Michigan-Huron would be the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, surpassing even Lake Superior. However, since the U.S. Canada border only traverses Lake Huron. We continue to treat them as two distinct lakes, a situation where geographical accuracy yields to political delineation. Insight 31. Niagara Falls Backward Progression. Niagara Falls was once 7 miles downstream and is actively receding. Formed approximately 12,500 years ago, the falls originally stood 7 miles downstream, close to Lewiston, New York. The relentless force of the water erodes the softer shale beneath the harder limestone, leading to the collapse of the cliff face and the gradual backward movement of the falls. During the 1800s, it retreated at a rate of 5 feet annually. Engineers now divert half of the water into hydroelectric turbines specifically to mitigate this process, reducing the retreat to about a foot each year. However, the fundamental geological processes will prevail. In roughly 50,000 years, the falls will reach Lake Erie, transform into a series of rapids, and consequently eliminate one of the world's most iconic border landmarks. Insight 30. The U.S. Army temporarily shut down Niagara Falls. In June 1969, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers accomplished what seemed utterly incredible. They turned off Niagara Falls, specifically the American side, by constructing a 600-foot dam using 28,000 tons of rock. They diverted the entire flow of the river to Canada, leaving the American cliff face completely dry for the first time in 12,000 years. The exposed riverbed revealed a landscape of jagged boulders, millions of coins, and 2 sets of human remains. Engineers spent months securing steel bolts into the cliff to prevent further erosion, then detonated the dam in November. The falls subsequently roared back to life as if nothing had ever happened. Insight 29. Significant water diversion away from the falls. Here's a detail tourism brochures tend to omit. Up to 75% of the Niagara River's water is regularly siphoned off into hydroelectric tunnels before it ever reaches the falls. The majority of this diversion occurs overnight and during the winter months, when visitor numbers are at their lowest. During peak daylight hours, a treaty between the U.S. and Canada mandates a particular minimum water flow to maintain the fall's spectacular appearance. Beyond these designated periods, the river predominantly diverts underground to generate electricity. That impressive roaring cascade you're photographing is entirely authentic, yet it's also a meticulously managed display operating on a precise timetable. Fact 28. Niagara Falls erode 60 tons of rock every minute. Have you ever wondered about the uncanny, brilliant green hue of Niagara Falls? It's certainly not a digital filter. It's the result of continuous geological pulverization. Each minute, the river carries off roughly 60 tons of dissolved minerals and incredibly fine rock powder, primarily calcium carbonate ground from the limestone riverbed. This suspended particulate matter reflects sunlight, creating that characteristic emerald radiance. At the base, air bubbles collapse with sufficient force to fragment rock, a process known as cavitation. This prominent border landmark is essentially a 60-ton-per-minute demolition project, gradually eroding the demarcation between two nations. Fact 27. Ice volcanoes form exclusively on the Great Lakes. In the depths of winter, the U.S.-Canada border doesn't merely freeze over, it actively erupts. Along the Great Lakes coastline, unique ice volcanoes emerge when winter waves become trapped beneath ice shelves. Pressure forces water upward through cracks, propelling it into the frigid air, where it solidifies almost instantaneously. These conical ice formations can reach heights of 30 feet and function as natural barriers, absorbing storm energy and safeguarding the shoreline. However, approaching them is ill-advised. Their hollow craters could plunge you directly into the churning, icy lake below. They are both visually stunning and inherently perilous. Fact 26. Huge salt deposits are concealed beneath the border lakes. Long before the existence of the Great Lakes, this entire territory was submerged under shallow inland seas. These ancient seas evaporated, leaving behind vast salt deposits buried thousands of feet beneath what are now Lake Erie and Lake Huron. Currently, these deposits are actively extracted through subterranean mining operations that have been underway since the 1950s. The extracted salt is primarily used for de-icing winter roads throughout the Northeast. Consequently, the international boundary that appears on the lake surface conceals an entirely different world beneath it, a world both countries have been mining for decades. Fact 25. The Great Lakes are geological newcomers. We often perceive the Great Lakes as ancient, but in geological terms, they are practically brand new. Merely 14,000 years ago, the entire region was covered by a 2-mile thick sheet of ice. As this ice melted, it sculpted the lake basins we observe today. Here's the truly astonishing detail. Humans were already cultivating wheat in the Middle East before these lakes even came into being. The Great Lakes didn't achieve their present configurations until approximately 3,000 years ago, meaning they are younger than the pyramids of Egypt. On Earth's 24-hour timeline, the U.S.-Canada water border was established roughly 2 seconds ago. Fact 24. The land near the border is still ascending due to prehistoric ice. The U.S.-Canada border is literally moving upwards. During the last ice age, glaciers several miles thick pressed down on the Earth's crust by hundreds of feet. The ice has receded, but the land continues to rebound in a process termed isostatic uplift. This is occurring rapidly enough that GPS stations along the border require annual recalibration. In Lake Huron, the rising crust is pushing new islands out of the water and leaving historic boat docks stranded hundreds of feet from the shore. This entire international demarcation lies on a continent that has yet to complete its vertical adjustment. Fact 23. The border encompasses over 1,800 islands. The Thousand Islands section of the St. Lawrence River certainly lives up to its name, and then some. The U.S.-Canada border in this area winds its way through more than 1,800 distinct islands. Some are expansive enough for grand residences, while others are barely large enough to accommodate a single flagpole. Some are situated within the U.S., some in Canada, and some essentially straddle the dividing line, with neighbors close enough to row between them in under a minute. This isn't a border that simply follows a river. It's a border that becomes utterly lost within a labyrinth of rock and water, then gradually reemerges. Fact 22. 6 airports straddle the border, with runways in both countries. There are 6 airports along the U.S.-Canada border where you can touch down in one nation and taxi into the other without ever leaving the paved surface. Runways like the one at Piney Pine Creek in Minnesota physically span the international line. At Avey Field in Washington, you can land in the U.S., but are obligated to formally export your aircraft just to refuel, as the gas pumps are located in British Columbia. These aren't loopholes, they are rigorously monitored zones. Traversing the border on wheels is permitted, but if your feet touch the wrong side without customs authorization, anticipate a very lengthy discussion. Fact 21. 2 border crossings operate as one way only. Among the 119 official crossings, 2 function like revolving doors that permit passage in only a single direction. At Trout River, New York, you can enter the U.S. from Canada, but heading north is forbidden. At Four Falls, New Brunswick, entry into Canada from Maine is permitted, though movement in the opposite direction is strictly forbidden. This constitutes an unyielding international sovereignty principle. Arriving oriented incorrectly offers no recourse, no exemption, and no possibility for a U-turn. It's the sole locale on the continent where the international boundary functions as a literal one-way route. Fact 20. The 360-foot smuggling passage. In 2005, officials discovered the inaugural cross-border illicit tunneling operation beneath a garden shed in British Columbia. Stretching 360 feet underground, it extended below a highway and surfaced through a living room floor in Linden, Washington. Inside, it boasted electric lighting, ventilation, and robust wooden supports. For numerous months, authorities observed traffickers moving cannabis-filled hockey bags through it before finally shutting it down. And upon its closure, they didn't merely secure the entrance. They injected thousands of gallons of concrete into the tunnel, forever joining a section of Canada to the United States beneath the earth. Fact 19. There exists a library where you can step in through an American entrance and peruse books in Canada. The Haskell Free Library sounds like something plucked from a movie scene. Constructed in 1904 precisely on the Vermont-Quebec border, a dark line bisects the flooring, denoting where the United States concludes and Canada commences. For over a century, patrons could traverse this internal boundary without passport checks, exchanging literature and conversations as if no division existed. However, in 2025, the situation changed. U.S. authorities prohibited Canadian citizens from entering via the primary American side door without first undergoing border inspection. Currently, a former emergency exit serves as a distinct Canadian point of entry. Fact 18. You can witness a performance in America staged in Canada. Directly above the Haskell Library, a 400-seat Victorian opera house features one of the most unconventional layouts imaginable in entertainment. The audience occupies seats in the United States, while the performers act on a Canadian stage. The 1783 boundary diagonally dissects the building, visibly marked by a dark line that follows the floor and extends beneath the seating, mirroring the library's unique characteristic from the previous point. Spectators in the front rows might have their feet planted in Quebec while munching popcorn in Vermont. Even the dressing rooms where actors prepare are entirely within Canadian territory. This arrangement has persisted since 1904, making it the only venue on Earth where a paying audience enjoys a live show unfolding in a different nation. Fact 17. The border vanishes into the planet's most expansive international canoe wilderness, where Minnesota's boundary waters meet Ontario's Quetico Provincial Park. The U.S.-Canada divide dissolves into 2.2 million acres of protected wildlands. For 150 miles, the frontier meanders through over 1,000 glacial lakes. There are no customs checkpoints, no paved thoroughfares, just brass markers on ancient granite, and a 20-foot wide clearing cut through pine forests. To cross, you don't present a passport. Instead, you propel a canoe across an invisible demarcation. It's among the rare locales globally where two formidable nations simply allow nature to completely absorb their shared boundary. Fact 16. It's possible to inadvertently paddle into Canada without realizing it. Within the boundary waters, you might become an unwitting international transgressor. The forest appears identical on both sides. There's no cellular service, no signage, no warning sirens, and hundreds of canoeists unknowingly drift into Canada or the U.S. annually. Technically, a remote area permit is required for crossing. Realistically, you obtain one now. The boundary is indiscernible. You can navigate border lakes without documentation, but if your footwear touches the incorrect shoreline or your paddle scrapes the wrong lake bed, you've just unlawfully entered another nation. It constitutes the mildest international incident you'll ever commit. Fact 15. Wilderness border markers are transported by canoe. In most regions, the U.S.-Canada border is maintained via drones and sophisticated sensors. In Minnesota's boundary waters, its upkeep relies on a paddle. This protected wilderness prohibits motorized vessels, leaving the International Boundary Commission with no alternative. Crews board canoes and portage deep into the forest to manually repair border monuments. They follow the same routes utilized by indigenous peoples and fur traders 4 centuries ago. Markers are constructed in sections and carried over miles of rocky and muddy terrain. A 21st century international boundary sustained with 17th century brute force. Fact 14. The conflict almost initiated by a hog. In 1859, the United States and Great Britain nearly engaged in warfare over a singular farm animal. On San Juan Island, a contested rock situated between Washington State and British Columbia, an American colonist shot a pig belonging to a British farmer because it was consuming his potatoes. Within weeks, the U.S. deployed 400 soldiers. Britain countered with 5 warships and 2,000 personnel. For 13 years, both armed forces encamped on opposing sides of the island, and rather than fighting, they hosted dinner gatherings and played cricket. The German Kaiser ultimately ruled in America's favor. The pig remained the sole casualty. Fact 13. The rock formations at Niagara Falls exhibit tropical characteristics. Niagara Falls symbolizes the frigid north, yet its geological foundation originates from the equator. Source language: English. Around 440 million years ago, this particular segment of the border was submerged beneath a warm, shallow tropical sea. The hard rock layer that holds Niagara Falls together is actually a petrified reef formed from billions of ancient sea creatures. This structure, known as Lockport Dolostone, functions like a sturdy stone ledge, steadfastly resisting the water's force, while the softer material beneath it gradually erodes. Each time a piece breaks off and plummets into the chasm, you're observing a fragment of Earth's prehistoric tropics disintegrating in real time. Fact number 12, Lake Superior is so immense it generates its own weather systems. As the planet's largest freshwater lake by surface area, Lake Superior behaves like a miniature ocean. The sheer thermal capacity of its water moderates the climate of the entire bordering region, making summers cooler and winters milder in a way no ordinary lake could. When frigid air sweeps across its surface, Superior conjures lake-effect snowstorms that can dump many feet of snow on the shoreline within hours. It can also produce waves exceeding 20 feet during severe tempests and has claimed hundreds of vessels. While technically accurate to call it a lake, that designation is a significant understatement. Fact number 11, the residential boundary at Lake Metagoge. The international border cuts directly through people's backyards here. Due to a peculiar geographical quirk, several Canadian families own lakeside cottages where their living room is situated in Manitoba, but their boat dock extends into North Dakota. Each time they head to the water for a swim, They are technically crossing into the United States. Some residents pay property taxes to both nations simply to retain ownership of both their home and their dock. You might sleep in Canada, but your watercraft is considered an American resident. And these regulations, no matter how illogical, are absolute. Fact number 10. During Prohibition, the border became a major conduit for liquor. When the United States enacted a nationwide ban on alcohol in 1920, the Canadian border transformed into the continent's primary pipeline for illicit spirits. No area was more chaotic than the Windsor-Detroit corridor. This mile-wide stretch of river was responsible for transporting 75% of all illegal alcohol entering America. Rum running quickly became Detroit's second biggest industry, surpassed only by automobile manufacturing. Smugglers employed high-speed boats, submerged cables, and even convoys that traversed the frozen winter ice. Today, the riverbed is strewn with the remains of rum runner vehicles that broke through, serving as underwater relics of an era when the border was essentially paved with whiskey. Fact number 9. The quote 6. In 1838, the U.S. and Great Britain narrowly avoided a full-scale armed conflict over a forested region in Maine. The Aroostook War, colloquially known as the _7_7_ saw 50,000 troops mobilized on both sides. Not a single actual battle took place. The only reported casualty was a black bear shot by Canadians, which triggered a confused skirmish in the darkness. Diplomacy ultimately resolved the situation with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. This agreement not only prevented bloodshed, but also adjusted the border slightly southward, allowing the U.S. to finally retrieve Fort Blunder, a fortress they had mistakenly constructed on Canadian territory decades earlier. Fact number 8. The border bisects a golf course. At Aroostook Valley Country Club, a poorly hit golf ball can lead to an international incident. Established in 1929 to circumvent prohibition laws, the club's founders ensured that while cars were parked in Maine, the bar was located in Canada. Golfers could golf in America and enjoy drinks in New Brunswick without ever leaving the grounds. Today, those carefree days are over. Security is now sufficiently stringent that you must drive to an official checkpoint simply to get from your car to the first tee. And if your ball hook's left into Canada, just leave it. Attempting to retrieve it is considered an illegal border crossing. Fact number 7. The border traverses the oldest rock on Earth's surface, the Canadian Shield. The ancient Precambrian bedrock that underpins most of Ontario and Minnesota represents one of the oldest exposed geological formations on the planet. Portions of it are more than 4 billion years old. This rock was ancient before any fish came into existence, before the atmosphere contained enough oxygen for animals to breathe, and before anything more complex than a single-celled organism was alive. Glaciers scoured away everything that had accumulated on top, revealing the continent's raw foundation. Here, the border doesn't merely follow geographical features, it lies directly upon the original surface of North America. Fact number 6. The eastern border is just as irregular as its western counterpart. The surveying errors that resulted in the meandering 49th parallel out west were also present in the east. The border from New York through Vermont to New Hampshire is theoretically supposed to follow the 45th parallel, as mapped in the 1770s using instruments that were, to put it mildly, imprecise. The resulting line deviates over a mile from the correct parallel in certain sections. Currently, More than 420 monuments mark this surveyed line, not because it's accurate, but because it's official. The incorrect solution became the permanent one, just as it did 3,000 miles away. Fact number 5, homes with dual nationality. In Darby Line, the border line runs through residences. While the Haskell Library is renowned for the black tape marking the border on its floor, at least 5 other structures simultaneously exist in 2 countries. Source language: American English. One particular residence boasts a kitchen located in the U.S. and a dining room situated in Canada. Another instance involved a tool manufacturing facility where the international boundary bisected the operational machinery. To adhere to regulations, residents must utilize designated entry and exit points. Departing incorrectly is officially considered an unlawful border crossing. In Darby Line, the expression __8___ isn't merely figurative. It literally describes the path one takes to access the refrigerator. Shifting to our 4th fact, concealed sensors patrol the wilderness sections of the border. Traversing the remote, untamed expanses of the U.S.-Canada International Line on foot might suggest a pristine, desolate landscape. Just trees, quietude, and nothing else. However, beneath the earth, this area is extensively wired. Subterranean sensors strategically placed along pathways, roadways, and rail lines detect movement, automatically alerting border agencies. The meticulously cleared 20-foot strip also plays its part. Alongside approximately 8,000 permanent markers, what is frequently referred to as the world's longest undefended border is, in reality, among the most intensively monitored land segments globally. The surveillance, though imperceptible, is arguably more efficacious than any physical barrier. Our 3rd point highlights that a treaty prohibiting warships on the Great Lakes has remained in effect since 1817. In that year, a mere 5 years following a conflict both nations found mutually draining, the United States and Britain formalized the Rush-Bagot Agreement. This accord drastically reduced naval forces on the Great Lakes to just a few minor vessels for each country. No combat ships, no military buildup, no armed boats on the freshwater expanses. It represented one of the initial formal arms control pacts in modern history, and remarkably, it technically continues to be binding over 2 centuries later. 2 sovereign states, a single vast inland sea, and 0 warships, an accord predating most nations on Earth, quietly sustaining peace. The 2nd astounding fact reveals that the border follows a route established millennia before its official existence. Consider the trajectory of the U.S.-Canada border between Lake Superior and Lake of the Woods. Now observe the ancient waterways where indigenous populations traveled by canoe for thousands of years, and where French-Canadian fur traders later plied their routes. These paths are identical. The Pigeon River, the Boundary Waters Chain, the historical portage trails, these constituted the continent's primary travel arteries long before diplomats convened to delineate a boundary. They didn't invent a border. They merely codified one that had naturally evolved, a watery highway etched into the landscape millennia before its inscription on any map. Finally, for our top fact, 8,000 monuments that have endured every disagreement. Scattered across 5,525 miles of prairies, mountain passes, wildlands, and lakefronts are more than 8,000 individual markers delineating the U.S.-Canada boundary. These range from granite obelisks dating back to the 1800s to small metal cones in secluded forests and concrete pillars nestled in residential backyards. They have withstood harsh blizzards, devastating floods, 2 global conflicts, a Cold War, and every diplomatic squabble the 2 nations have ever encountered. On paper, this border appears almost mundane. 2 amicable countries, clear demarcations, virtually no discord. Yet on the ground, it stands as the longest enduring testament to human fallibility, determination, and geographical randomness that somehow cohered, and it continues to do so. Now, how about 50 astonishing facts about Arkansas geography you might not be aware of?